Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hefner again, and I'm coming to you today from Charlottesville, Virginia, standing in front of Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. This was the third version of the home. He started it, he tore it down, he built it again, tore part of it down, built it again, and this is as he left the house. It's preserved, it's held in private hands today, but it's preserved and it's open to the public, so for a fee, you can tour all three levels of the building. Plus, you can also tour the grounds outside. It's worth a trip. If you ever find yourself in Charlottesville, stop by. So, what about Thomas Jefferson? Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence wasn't written by Thomas Jefferson alone, but he did the first draft. So, when the Continental Congress finally agreed that it was time to write a Declaration of Independence, to basically send a letter to King George III and say, that's it, we've had it, we're leaving, and here are the reasons why, it's hard to get an entire Congress to write something with a single mind. And so usually what happens is you form a committee, and the committee works. And in this case, the committee was made up of Thomas Jefferson, it was Robert Livingston, it was Roger Sherman of Connecticut, it was John Adams, and Ben Franklin. And for whatever reason, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson seem to get credit. The other two get forgotten. And in reality, the committee directed Thomas Jefferson to sit down and come up with the first draft. So Jefferson did the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and then the committee worked on that, crossing some things out, changing some things. When they were happy, they took it to the Continental Congress as a whole, when they again started making plenty of changes, and we'll talk about some of those changes. But let's get started with the introduction to this, and we'll work our way through this interesting, somewhat challenging to read, but definitely interesting document. Here's a photograph for you. Well, I shouldn't say a photograph. It's a modern day kind of representation, drawing, colors. I don't know. Is it a word color? I don't know. But it has Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and of course Thomas Jefferson, and they're supposedly working on a draft of the Declaration of Independence. You see some of it scattered across the floor as they gave up and crumpled the paper away. But as I said before, this is a romantic kind of remembrance. It's got Adams and Franklin, who we've already read and love, but it's left out Roger Sherman, and it's left out Livingston as well. As we read this piece today, the Declaration of Independence, we're going to give Thomas Jefferson credit. And our lesson essential question is going to be, in what ways do both the style and content of this declaration reflect the philosophies of the American Revolution? So Thomas Jefferson was a student of the Enlightenment. He was particularly influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke and the whole concept of social contract. So we're going to look at that as we go through, see what similarities we can find. We want to look at the style of this document as well. It's obviously going to be formal. If you're writing basically a letter of secession and sending it to the king, you want it to be in the best language you have available to you. And then what it actually says. So many people are aware of the Declaration of Independence, and they know it declared, hence the name Declaration, our independence from Great Britain. But very, very few people have actually ever read it. And to see what's in it is kind of fascinating. It's complex on the surface, but its central core, whether its philosophy, is really quite simple. Let's find out a little bit about this author first, though. Thomas Jefferson was born in Virginia. He could not have been president had he not been born in the colonies, for the most part. As long as you were already a citizen by the time the Constitution was ratified, you could actually become president. But everybody that we had who was a United States president had actually been born here in the colonies. So he's born a Virginian, sees himself as a Virginian. He has money. He's able to go to the College of William and Mary, which was the nation's second college. The first was Harvard. We know that John Adams went there. The second was William and Mary, and then the third was going to be Yale College in Connecticut. While he was there, he studied law, and he was admitted to the bar in 1767. Now, until you can get a law degree, but you cannot practice law until the bar, which is the organization of fellow lawyers, admits you and says that you're competent to stand with them and argue cases on behalf of your clients. He served in politics from the very beginning. When he was a very young man, he served in the House of Burgesses, so that's the same organization that Patrick Henry had served in. And then he served in the Continental Congress representing Virginia. And that's going to be the organization which ultimately is tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence. He later serves in the Virginia House, the Virginia House of Delegates, which is sort of the same thing, but just for the state of Virginia. And he serves as minister to France under George Washington. When he comes back from France and the Constitution has been ratified, he finds out that Washington has already picked him to be Secretary of State. Jefferson is someone who does very well with the French. He can talk with them on their level. He speaks French. He speaks English. They're fascinated with him, and so he makes a perfect emissary to that country. Sometimes he got accused of being a Francophile, means that he was a little bit too friendly with the French, and under the Adams presidency, our country started to have problems with the French. We entered into something called a quasi-war, and Jefferson was seen as being kind of soft against the French, who were seen by many as being a potential enemy to the United States. He was the first Secretary of State for George Washington. He was the vice president under John Adams, and that's a kind of unusual thing by today's standards. Political parties just sprang up in the time period of Thomas Jefferson. And so when Adams was elected president, the Constitution actually allowed that whoever got the second most votes became the vice president. And so now we have a president and a vice president who were of different parties, Adams being a Federalist and Thomas Jefferson being a Democratic Republican. Under Jefferson's presidential administration, they changed that law, and ever since then, the president and the vice president have always been of the same party. The only time I could think that that would change now is if we had to go through the line of succession, if we lost both a president and a vice president, and there hadn't been any nomination to take over, then it would go to whoever the Speaker of the House is. And if the Speaker of the House is a different party, that means you would actually switch your party as that person stepped in to be president. After the French Revolution, Napoleon came to power, and France was fighting wars all over Europe. They needed money. They had this great chunk of land in the United States, and Jefferson pushed ahead to close that deal. Actually, what's kind of interesting is Robert Livingston, one of those 5 who served on the committee to write the Declaration of Independence. Robert Livingston was the person who actually negotiated that sale. But Thomas Jefferson pushed on that, and then Lewis and Clark were the ones who led the expedition going across this new land looking for a water passage to get to the Pacific Ocean. If I remember right, William Clark was a soldier, but Meriwether Lewis had actually been Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary, and he went on the mission so that he could take good notes and record the journey and come back eventually with all kinds of like relics that they brought back. If you ever get a chance to go to Monticello, which I have pictured throughout this presentation, inside the main entry hall, even today, the walls, and it's 2 floors, so it's the first floor and the second floor in this great entry hall. The walls are just covered with things that Lewis and Clark brought back with them after their expedition out west. Another thing that Thomas Jefferson's credited with is he himself started the University of Virginia. It was his house Monticello sat on, it literally means little mountain, sat on this little hill, big hill actually, little mountain, big hill, I don't know, and it looked down into the valley, and he decided he wanted the university where he could look down and see it. So he started the University of Virginia. It was one of his big projects. It's one of the things he was most proud about in his lifetime. And another thing about Monticello that's interesting is if you go to Jefferson's library, and he had quite an extensive library. When Jefferson came back from his time in France, he had thousands of boxes of books that he had bought while he was there. He loved to read. But when you go into his library today at Monticello, unlike Adams' library up in Braintree, it's completely empty. There are no books on the shelves. It's like, where did all the books go? And it's because Thomas Jefferson started the United States Library of Congress. And he started that by donating all of his books to become the seed books for that library. So you don't see the books in his house anymore because they're all at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And we already talked about this. It's complicated down here. the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. While they were president and vice president, and they fought tooth and nail because of their different philosophies of how a government of the people should be run, they both respected one another as intellectuals. And they wrote letters back and forth throughout their entire lives. And we've already talked how they both died on the same July 4th and seemed to be concerned that the other one might still be alive. Jefferson died before Adams did. These are some photographs I took on a visit, I think it was 2013. I made a weekend trip over Easter break from school down to see Monticello. So this is actually the front of the house. It looks small. It looks like it's only one floor, but the second floor is kind of hidden, and the first floor is actually below ground on this side, above ground on the other. And then this is the back. Most people think the back looks like the front. It's very beautiful, and it has a large kind of backyard with gardens and things like that all around it. Jefferson was interested in this kind of revival architecture. He designed the dome up top, the windows, the pillars, and it was, like I said, it was his project. He started it, destroyed what he had, started over again. He's buried on his property. All of the Jeffersons are buried on a property. And there's a large monument. And this is actually a photograph that I took here of what the inscription says. And I think this tells us a lot about who Thomas Jefferson was. So it says, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson." And now he listed what he saw as his biggest accomplishment. Author of the Declaration of Independence. So even though it was a committee of 5 and he was given the power to write that first draft, he sees himself as the author, and we give him credit today. He was also author of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. One of his big things for Virginia, again, religious freedom. And this is a little hard to read down here on my picture, and father of the University of Virginia. Those 3 things are what Jefferson himself decided he wanted on his monument. What's noticeably absent is President of the United States. He did not see that as a major accomplishment. He saw setting up the government and creating it as an accomplishment, but just sitting in the executive seat because you got the vote of the majority of the people was not something that he wanted on his tombstone. Now, the Declaration of Independence, even though we give Thomas Jefferson credit for writing it, it actually gets started when another Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, who happens to be an uncle to Robert E. Lee, who led the Confederacy during the Civil War, Richard Henry Lee brings a proposal that the United States declare its independence from Britain. And after some debate and a decision that, well, we'll do it, but it's got to be unanimous. Not one colony can disagree, or we're not doing it. And so after much debate, they decided to do it, and they set up the Committee of 5, and Jefferson drafted the original draft, which then got the revision by Franklin and Adams and by Livingston and Robert Sherman. All right, as we read it, we're going to look at the style. We're going to look at the diction. One of the things we're going to look for is alliteration. And a lot of elementary school children understand alliteration, but when you start words with the same sound, even start same sound, that is alliteration. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Now, alliteration doesn't mean it's a tongue twister. It just means that those initial consonant sounds repeat. There's something about it that sounds cool, and so it becomes part of a writing style. The other thing we're going to look at is going to show up a lot in speeches and official documents. It's something called parallelism. So you know that in math class, parallel lines are lines that run side by side in the same plane, but they never intersect. One is just like the other. And in grammar, sometimes we have a sentence where we establish a certain pattern of words, subjects, verbs, adjectives, and we repeat that pattern over and over again for different sentences. They're all the same in their structure, even though they're separate sentences. So later on in this year, we're going to look at the Gettysburg Address, right? And the Gettysburg Address has things in it like we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. That we cannot, that's parallelism. In 9th grade, you may have read and studied Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, the one that he gave in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. We call it the I Have a Dream speech. I don't know that he named it that, but that's what we call it today. And that has a lot of parallelism. So we're going to look for parallelism in the Declaration of Independence as we go through that. Now, we can't watch a video inside a video here. That just doesn't work. But here's an image of one of the original copies. This is the copy that actually hangs in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. You can go see it. It's on display during the day in very low light conditions. Every night it goes deep into a darkened vault. It's protected by inert gases, protected from any kind of damaging light. But you can kind of see it looks very hard to read. For years, it actually hung in a hallway in the sunlight and was damaged, considerably. Now we're trying to save it. Alrighty, as we read the Declaration of Independence, I want you to look for the principles that are declared. These are going to be Enlightenment principles, so keep your eyes open for these. Look for the use of the writing techniques like alliteration and like parallelism. All right, now, if you're watching the video on your own, you should stop the video right now, go read the Declaration of Independence, and then come back and finish the video. All right? If you've not seen the answers to the Check for Understanding questions, you still want to come here to the video and watch this, but we're going to do the Check for Understanding questions now. You should not do these until you've read the Declaration. All right, fill in the blanks using the following terms. You may not use every term, and you may use some terms more than once. Number one, blank is a rhetorical technique in which a writer emphasizes the equal value or weight of two or more ideas by expressing them in the same grammatical form. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot have, and that's going to be parallelism. All right, hopefully you got that. Number two, blank is an organizational strategy in which the author describes a situation and then he explains the reasons for that situation. Now, we might say, we might actually describe this as a number of different things here. It might be like emphasis, or it might be elaboration, but we don't have those as choices. So we're going to go with cause and effect. And in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson is going to keep saying, because the king has done this, this has resulted. Because the king has done this, this has resulted. All right, number three, blank is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words, and if you remember that from elementary school, you know that is alliteration. That's alliteration with an A. All right, do some multiple choices. According to the Declaration of Independence, what do the laws of nature and nature's God entitle the colonists to? Now, natural law is a very Enlightenment kind of concept, and they believe that they are entitled to the right to govern themselves. A king cannot be a king without a people, but a people can be a people without a king. Keep that in mind. Against whom does the Declaration list its complaints? And of course, it's the King of England, but what was his name? It wasn't George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. They are not the King of England. It would have been King George III to be precise. What does the line, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes? Now, prudence, this word right here, means good judgment. So good judgment determines that if you've got a longly established government, you shouldn't change it because of light causes, which might mean unimportant causes, and transiency means they're only temporary. If there's a problem with government that will end with the next election, you don't need to change all the laws of the government, right? On the other hand, if you've got a king and he's constantly been making major problems and you know it's not going to change, then you have the right to make your own decisions here. And so that's what the people believed at this point. In the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it ends with, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. All right? So the question is, to whom are these people pledging this? The king, to the Declaration itself, to George Washington, or to each other? Well, when I read this, I automatically filled in, we mutually pledge to each other. And so each other is correct. Benjamin Franklin made this kind of scary kind of joke after they signed the Declaration, and he said, if we don't hang together now, we'll surely hang separately. Because once they signed this, they all became traitors to the British Crown. And so at that point, they had to stick together, and so they pledged everything they had for the benefit of the entire group. What's the purpose of the second section? So the Declaration of Independence is in 3 parts. And we talked about that in class, but not part of this presentation. So hopefully you noticed it if you read it on your own. What's the purpose of the second part of the Declaration? And that would be, it's a list of complaints against England. So real quickly, the first part is kind of like, Dear King George, this is what's been going on, and this is why we believe we have a right to break away from Britain and establish our own government. The first part is the Enlightenment philosophy. The second part is literally a laundry list. The king has done this. The king has done this. The king has done this. And it's just item after item after item of stuff we can't take anymore. And then the last part is actually the Declaration. We are now declaring that we are free and independent states. We can wage war. There's a little thread in there because we're now an independent country. We can wage war. We can set up our own economy. We can conduct business with other countries. And so you want to do something about it? Come and get it, George. Come and get it. All right. And finally, some true and falses. True or false? The Declaration is written in first person. And that's true. You know, it starts out in Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, you know, when in the course of human events becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. And then it says we. And that we is a plural. So it doesn't say I, but you can have first person singular or you could have first person plural. How about number 2? The Declaration can be divided into 3 parts. Yes, of course, we just said that. The first part, again, is here's our reasoning behind all of this. The second part is here's what you've done wrong to offend us. And the third part is here's what we're doing about it. We're breaking away from England and forming our own country. True or false? Ben Franklin helped draft the Declaration of Independence, and of course that's true. It was Ben Franklin, it was Thomas Jefferson, it was John Adams. They always get credit. But then we often forget about Robert Livingston, who was from New York, and the other guy was from Connecticut, Roger Sherman. He was a cobbler to start out his life. Connecticut made a lot of shoes in the early days, and there were a lot of cobblers, especially in western Connecticut. But he rose up as a businessman, middle class, just like Benjamin Franklin did. He wasn't born into wealth and fame. He achieved it through the American dream. Number 4, the author claims that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are rights bestowed upon people by God, and that's Thomas Jefferson. He is a student of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and absolutely, these are things which they can only be taken from us if we willingly give them away. And so as a people here in the colonies, in early United States, we believe that these are natural rights. That word natural rights is a pure Enlightenment philosophy phrase. And the last one, the original draft of the Declaration of Independence included a statement against slavery. And that is absolutely true. Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. All right, no question about that today. It's been in the news a lot. But Thomas Jefferson believed that we needed to do away with slavery. Now, so why didn't he just do that then? This was a problem with a lot of slaveholders in those days. Many of them had slaves and wanted to end slavery. But for them to do it all by themselves meant financial ruin if others have the financial advantage of being able to use slave labor. And so even in New York State, where there was an organization called the Manumission Society, it was a group that was focused on getting rid of slavery. At one point, 80% of the members had slaves. An organization wanting to do away with slavery, and most of the members were slaveholders. It was a strange time. And in the South, they used to call slavery their peculiar institution. All right, so again, that's a true. So all of these were true. Right. So that's our Declaration of Independence. If you've already read it, great. I hope you found it fascinating. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Don't try to fake your way through this. Most Americans have never read this incredibly important document. And if you spend just 20 minutes of your life doing it once, that puts you in a minority of people. So good luck with it. And thanks for staying with me till the end.